The blood had dried dark beneath her fingernails, and no amount of scrubbing at the creek could wash away what she'd done. Sarah Catherine Monroe sat hunched over the cold water, her reflection fractured by ripples, watching pieces of herself scatter and reform like broken glass. 3 days she'd been running, 3 days since the kitchen knife had found its mark, 3 days since Vincent Harlow had finally pushed too far. The bruises on her throat were fading to yellow, but the memory of his hands, his rage, his promise that she'd never leave alive, that burned fresh as the moment it happened. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Montana Territory, October 1887, the first snow of the season, drifted down like ash, settling on Sarah's shoulders as she stumbled through the timber. Her dress, once blue as summer sky, was torn at the sleeve and stained with mud, and worse things she tried not to think about. The carpet bag in her left hand contained everything she owned now, a spare chemise, her mother's silver locket, and $23 in crumpled bills that represented her entire life savings. She'd been walking since dawn, following game, trails that wound through dense stands of lodgepole pine and aspen. Her boots, meant for parlor floors not wilderness paths, had rubbed blisters that wept and stung with each step. The leather soles were thin, offering little protection from the sharp stones and hidden roots that seemed to reach up and grab at her feet. Behind her, somewhere in the distance she couldn't calculate, men were looking. She knew this with the certainty of prey, could feel their attention like ice between her shoulder blades. Sheriff Kowalski would have found Vincent's body by now. The neighbors would have heard her screaming, seen her running from the cabin with blood on her hands. They'd pieced together their own version of what happened, and in their version, she'd be guilty of murder. Sarah paused beside a fallen log, pressing her back against the rough bark. Her breath came in short puffs that hung in the cold air like small ghosts. She pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, but the wool was damp and provided little warmth. Her fingers, once soft from a life of tending house and garden, were now scratched raw from pushing through brambles and thorny undergrowth. The silence of the forest pressed against her ears. No bird songs, no rustling of small creatures, just the whisper of snow falling through pine needles and her own ragged breathing. She closed her eyes and tried to remember what peace felt like, but all she could see was Vincent's face in that final moment, his eyes wide with surprise as the blade slid between his ribs. She hadn't meant to kill him. That truth sat heavy in her chest, more weight than she could carry. For 2 years she'd endured his drunken rages, his fists, his promises that he'd change. She'd believed him every time he'd wept and begged forgiveness, believed him when he said he loved her more than life itself. Love, she'd learned, could be the cruelest word in any language. That last night had started like so many others. Vincent had come home reeking of whiskey and fury, his wages spent at Henderson's saloon while she waited with his dinner growing cold on the table. She tried to slip past him to the bedroom, but his hand had caught her wrist, his fingers closing like a trap. "Where do you think you're going?" His words had slurred together, but his grip was steady and strong. "Just to fetch your plate," she'd whispered, keeping her voice level and quiet the way she'd learned to do. "Your supper's ready." But something was different that night. Some final thread had snapped inside him, and his other hand had closed around her throat. Not the first time she bore the faded fingerprints of previous nights, but this time his eyes held a finality that terrified her more than pain ever could. "You think I don't know," he'd hissed, spittle flecking her face. "You think I don't. See how you look at other men? How you plan to leave me?" She hadn't been planning to leave. The thought lived in her mind like a caged bird, but she'd never had the courage to open the door. Where would she go? What would she do? Women like her didn't survive alone in this territory, not without family or means. His fingers had tightened. On her windpipe, cutting off her air, her words, her world. Black spots had danced at the edges of her vision, and she'd clawed at his hands, desperate for breath, for life, for one more moment. Her fingers had found the kitchen knife on the counter behind her, the one she'd been using to slice the bread for his meal. She hadn't thought, hadn't planned. Survival had moved her hand, desperation had guided the blade. One thrust, upward and deep, and Vincent had stumbled backward, his eyes wide with shock and something that might have been respect. He'd looked down at the handle protruding from his chest, touched it with trembling fingers, then looked at her with an expression she'd never seen before. Not anger, not hatred, but surprise. "Sarah," he'd whispered. And then his knees had folded and he'd dropped to the kitchen floor like a sack of grain. She'd stood over him for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, watching the life drain from his eyes, waiting for him to get up and finish what he'd started. But Vincent Harlow would never get up again, would never raise his hand in anger, would never make another promise he didn't intend to keep. The first sob had torn from her throat like something being born. She dropped to her knees beside his body, her hands fluttering over his chest, his face, as if she could somehow call back what she'd taken. But the dead don't return, not even the ones who deserved killing. She'd packed her bag by lamplight, her hands shaking so badly she could barely fold her few belongings. The $23 had been hidden in a coffee tin under the floorboards, her escape money, saved penny by penny from the household funds Vincent gave her each week. Money she'd never found the courage to use until she had no choice. The door had closed behind her with a sound like judgment, final and irrevocable. She'd walked into the night with snow beginning to fall, walked away from the only life she'd known, away from the man she'd loved and feared and finally killed. Now, 3 days later, she was no closer to safety than she'd been in her own kitchen. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, a maze of timber and stone that offered no clear path to salvation. Her stomach cramped with hunger. She'd eaten nothing but berries and creek water since leaving the cabin, and her body ached with exhaustion that went deeper than muscle and bone. A branch snapped somewhere behind her, and Sarah's head jerked up, her heart slamming against her ribs. She listened, every nerve stretched tight, but heard only the soft whisper of falling snow. Still, the feeling of being watched crawled up her spine like cold fingers. She pushed herself up from the log, ignoring the protests of her battered feet, and continued deeper into the wilderness. The trees began to thin as she climbed higher into the mountains, and the snow fell heavier, collecting in the folds of her dress and melting against her skin. Her shawl was soaked through now, offering no protection from the cold that seeped into her bones. She wrapped her arms around herself and pressed forward, following what might have been a deer path, or might have been nothing more than wishful thinking. As afternoon faded toward evening, the temperature dropped, and the snow turned to ice pellets that stung her face and hands. Sarah's legs trembled with each step, and she knew she couldn't go much farther. She needed shelter, warmth, food, but the forest offered none of these things, only endless trees and the promise of a cold death if she stopped moving. Her foot caught on a hidden root, and she stumbled forward, her carpetbag flying from her numb fingers to spill its contents across the frozen ground. She fell hard, her knees striking stone, her palms scraping against ice-crusted earth. For a moment she lay there, cheek pressed to the ground, and considered simply staying down. It would be easier than fighting, easier than running, easier than carrying the weight of what she'd done. But something deep inside her, some stubborn spark that had survived 2 years of Vincent's cruelty, refused to be extinguished. She pushed herself up, gathered her scattered belongings, and forced her legs to carry her forward. One step, then another, each one a small victory against despair. The last light of day was fading when she crested a ridge and saw smoke rising in the distance, a thin grey line against the darkening sky that might as well have been a prayer answered. Sarah stared at it for a long moment, afraid to hope, afraid to believe that salvation might be possible. But the smoke was real, and where there was smoke there were people, and where there were people there might be mercy. She started down the far side of the ridge, her pace quickening despite her exhaustion. The trees closed around her again, but now they seemed less like a prison and more like a pathway leading her home. The snow continued to fall, but she barely felt it. All her attention was focused on that distant promise of warmth and light, and the possibility that she might survive this night after all. As she walked, Sarah tried to prepare herself for what lay ahead. What would she say to explain her presence in the wilderness, alone and clearly desperate? How could she make them understand without revealing the truth that would surely see her hanged? The law didn't make allowances for women who killed their husbands, no matter how justified the cause. But those were questions for later. For now, it was enough to keep moving, to follow the smoke toward whatever waited at its source. Behind her, the forest held its secrets, her footprints already filling with snow, her trail growing cold. Ahead, the unknown beckoned with possibilities, both frightening and full of hope. Sarah Catherine Monroe pulled her torn shawl closer around her shoulders and walked toward the light, carrying her guilt and her desperate need for sanctuary into an uncertain future. The blood beneath her fingernails had dried to rust, but the memory of what she'd done would never wash clean. All she could do now was survive, one step at a time, and hope that somewhere in this vast wilderness she might find someone who could. Look at her with Vincent's blood on her hands and still see a human being worth saving. The cabin materialized from the swirling snow like something conjured from desperate prayer. Sarah stumbled to a halt at the edge of the clearing, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air as she took in the sight before her. Warm yellow light spilled from two windows, painting golden rectangles on the snow-covered ground. Smoke rose steady and true from a stone chimney, and she could smell wood smoke mixed with something that made her empty stomach clench with need. Bread baking, perhaps, or stew simmering over coals. It was a modest structure, built from peeled logs and chinked with river stone, but to Sarah's desperate eyes it appeared more beautiful than any mansion. A covered porch wrapped around the front, its roof heavy with accumulated snow. A wooden bucket sat overturned beside the door, and a pair of worn leather boots waited on the threshold, as if their owner had just stepped inside for the evening. Sarah pressed herself against the rough bark of a large pine, her heart hammering so hard she feared it might burst from her chest. She was close enough now to hear sounds from within, the scrape of chair legs against wood flooring, the clink of metal against ceramic, the low murmur of a man's voice, though she couldn't make out words. Only one voice, she noted with a mixture of relief and fresh anxiety. A single occupant might mean safety, or it might mean something else entirely. Her fingers found the handle of the kitchen knife she'd tucked into her carpet bag after. The blade was clean now, scrubbed in a dozen different streams during her flight, but her hand still trembled at its touch. She'd killed one man already. The thought of having to defend herself again made bile rise in her throat. But the cold was seeping through her wet clothes, and her legs shook, not just with fear, but with the bone-deep exhaustion that comes from 3 days of running on empty. She had perhaps an hour of daylight left, if that, and the temperature was dropping fast. Pride and caution were luxuries she could no longer afford. Sarah forced herself to step from behind the tree and into the clearing. Her boots crunched in the fresh snow, each step unnaturally loud in the mountain stillness. She made it halfway, to the porch before her courage failed, and she stopped again, swaying slightly as dizziness washed over her. The door opened before she could decide whether to continue forward or flee back into the forest. A man stepped onto the porch, tall and lean with shoulders broad enough to fill the doorframe. He wore a red flannel shirt, rolled up at the sleeves despite the cold, and his hair was the color of summer wheat with threads of silver at the temples. His face was weathered but not unkind, with lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into sun and wind rather than anger. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the 20 paces that separated them. Sarah felt exposed, vulnerable, certain that her guilt must be written plainly across her features. This man would take one look at her and see exactly what she was, a murderer fleeing justice, dangerous and unworthy of help. But when he spoke, his voice was calm and measured, with none of the suspicion she'd expected. "Evening, miss. You look like you could use some warming up." Sarah's throat was so dry that her first attempt at speech came out as barely a whisper. She swallowed hard and tried again. Yes, sir. I'm sorry to trouble you. I was traveling and got turned around in the storm." It wasn't entirely a lie, though it left out the more damning details. She watched his face carefully for any sign that he didn't believe her, any hint that he might have heard about Vincent, about her. But his expression remained neutral, almost gentle. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "No trouble at all," he said, stepping down from the porch. His movements were deliberate and unthreatening, like a man approaching a spooked horse. "I'm Thomas Whitmore. This is my place." "Sarah," she managed, then caught herself before she could add her surname. Sarah Mitchell. The name of her childhood friend, borrowed out of necessity. Thomas nodded, as if the name suited her perfectly. "Well, Miss Mitchell, you're welcome to come inside and get warm. I've got coffee on the stove and stew that's been simmering all day. You look like you could use both." The offer was so simple, so generous, that Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. When was the last time someone had spoken to her with such basic kindness? Vincent's cruelty had poisoned even her interactions with neighbors and shopkeepers, his jealousy ensuring that she rarely spoke to anyone beyond the most necessary exchanges. "That's very kind," she said, taking a tentative step forward. "But I don't want to impose. I could just warm myself by your fire for a moment, then be on my way." Thomas shook his head, snow catching in his hair like premature frost. "Weather's turning nasty, and it'll be dark soon. These mountains aren't forgiving to travelers caught out in a storm, especially not—" He paused, his eyes taking in her thin dress, her inappropriate footwear, the carpet bag she clutched like a lifeline. "Especially not folks who aren't equipped for it." His assessment was accurate, but delivered without judgment, and Sarah felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. This man seemed to see her desperation without condemning her for it. Perhaps, just perhaps, she might survive this encounter without having to reveal the truth of what she'd done. "I don't have much money," she said, hating the admission but knowing it was necessary. "I couldn't pay you properly for food and shelter." "Don't recall asking for payment," Thomas replied, his mouth quirking into what might have been a smile. "Come on inside before you freeze to death on my doorstep. I'd hate to have to explain that to the neighbors." Despite everything, Sarah almost smiled at that. There were no neighbors for miles in any direction, as her desperate journey had proven. But she recognized the gentle humor for what it was, an attempt to put her at ease, to make this interaction feel normal and safe. She followed him up the porch steps, noting how he moved slightly ahead, but never turned his back completely to her. Either he was naturally cautious, or he sensed something about her situation that made him wary. The thought made her grip her carpet bag tighter, the weight of the hidden knife a cold reminder of what she was capable of. The cabin's interior was everything the exterior had promised and more. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, flames dancing merrily behind a wrought-iron screen. The furniture was simple but well-made, a sturdy wooden table, 2 ladder-back chairs, a rocking chair positioned near the fire with a wool blanket. draped over its arm. Books lined shelves built into the walls, more books than Sarah had seen outside of the general store in town. The kitchen occupied one corner of the main room, separated by a long wooden counter. Copper pots hung from hooks, and she could see the promised coffee pot steaming on the cast-iron stove. The smell of food was stronger here, rich and savory, and utterly wonderful to her starved senses. "Sit wherever you're comfortable," Thomas said, hanging his coat on a peg by the door. "I'll get you something hot to drink." Sarah remained standing, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal seeking escape routes. There was a door she assumed led to a bedroom, another that might open onto a root cellar or storage room. The windows were covered with simple canvas curtains, but she could see the storm building outside, snow falling heavier now, with wind beginning to howl around the cabin's corners. Thomas returned, with a tin cup filled with coffee so hot that steam rose from its surface like incense. Sarah accepted it gratefully, wrapping her numb fingers around the warm metal and feeling sensations slowly return to her hands. The first sip was like salvation, bitter and strong and wonderfully real. "Thank you," she whispered, and meant it, more deeply than he could possibly know. "When's the last time you ate?" he asked, studying her face with eyes that were sharp but not unkind. Sarah tried to remember. Berries yesterday, or perhaps the day before. Time had become fluid during her flight, marked only by the rhythm of footsteps and the constant need to keep moving. "I'm not sure," she admitted. Thomas nodded as if her answer confirmed something he'd already suspected. He moved to the stove and began ladling stew into a ceramic bowl, the rich aroma making Sarah's mouth water despite her nervousness. When he set the bowl before her along with a thick slice of bread, she had to resist the urge to fall upon it. Like a wild thing, "Go ahead," he said gently, as if reading her thoughts. "There's plenty more where that came from." Sarah ate slowly at first, trying to maintain some semblance of ladylike behavior, but hunger soon overcame propriety. The stew was magnificent. Tender beef and vegetables in a savory broth that warmed her from the inside out. The bread was fresh and substantial, with a crust that crackled between her teeth. She finished every drop and crumb, then looked up, to find Thomas watching her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. "Better?" he asked. "Much. Thank you. I can't tell you how grateful." He waved off her thanks with a gesture that was somehow both dismissive and kind. "Gratitude's nice, but answers might be more useful. You want to tell me what you're really running from?" The question hit her like a physical blow, and Sarah felt all the warmth drain from her face. She set down the empty bowl with hands that trembled despite the coffee's heat. "I told you. I was traveling and got lost in the storm." Thomas leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled before him. "And this traveling, would it have anything to do with those bruises on your throat? Or the way you keep checking the windows, like you expect someone to come riding up any minute?" Sarah's hand flew instinctively to her neck, where Vincent's fingerprints had faded to yellow-green shadows. She'd forgotten about the marks, had hoped they weren't visible in the lamplight. Her throat worked soundlessly as she tried to think of an explanation that wouldn't reveal too much. "I see a lot of folks pass through these mountains," Thomas continued, his voice remaining calm and unthreatening. "Prospectors, trappers, families heading west. Most of them are running towards something, opportunity, land, a new life. But every now and then I get someone running away from something. Instead, usually they've got a good reason." "I'm not running from anything," Sarah said, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Course not," Thomas agreed mildly. "Just like you're not carrying a knife in that bag you won't let go of, and just like those aren't bloodstains under your fingernails that didn't quite scrub clean." Sarah's blood turned to ice water in her veins. She looked down at her hands and saw what his sharp eyes had already noted, the telltale dark crescents beneath her nails that no amount of creek water had been able to wash away completely. Vincent's blood, dried and persistent as guilt itself. Her first instinct was to run, to grab her bag and bolt for the door before he could stop her. But where would she go? Into the storm, into the night, into a wilderness that had already nearly killed her once. And what if he was faster, stronger? What if he decided she was too dangerous to let go? Her hand slid toward her carpet bag, toward the knife hidden within its folds. Thomas saw the movement and tensed slightly, but he didn't reach for a weapon of his own. Instead, he held up both hands in a gesture of peace. "Easy," he said softly. "I'm not your enemy here, Sarah. Whatever happened, whatever you did or didn't do, I'm not fixing to turn you over to anyone. But if you want my help, real help, not just a meal and a warm place to sleep, then I need to know what I'm dealing with." Sarah stared at him, this stranger who claimed to want to help her, who seemed to see through her lies with such unsettling clarity. Everything in her experience told her not to trust him, that men were dangerous creatures who used kindness as a weapon to get what they wanted. But there was something in his eyes, something steady and calm that made her want to believe him despite every instinct screaming at her to stay silent. "If I tell you," she whispered, "will you let me leave? If you decide you can't help me, will you just let me go back into the storm?" Thomas considered this for a long moment, snow tapping against the windows like ghostly fingers. "I suppose that depends on what you tell me," he said finally. "But I can promise you this. I won't hand you over to anyone without hearing your side of things first." It wasn't the guarantee she'd hoped for, but it was more than she'd expected from anyone. Sarah looked around the warm cabin one more time, taking in its safety and comfort, knowing that her next words might destroy any chance she had of staying. But she was tired of running, tired of lies, tired of carrying the weight of Vincent's death alone. "I killed a man," she said, the words falling into the quiet room like stones into still water. 3 days ago. I killed him, and now they're hunting me for murder." Thomas didn't flinch, didn't reach for a weapon or move toward the door. He simply nodded, as if she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. Was it self-defense? The question was asked so matter-of-factly that it took Sarah a moment to process it. She'd expected horror, revulsion, immediate rejection. Instead, he was asking for context, for her side of the story, just as he'd promised. "Yes," she breathed. He was going to kill me. I didn't have a choice." "Then you're safe now," Thomas said simply, "and we'll figure out the rest come morning." Sarah woke to the sound of an axe biting into wood, each strike ringing clear and sharp in the mountain air. For a moment she lay still, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings, soft mattress beneath her back, warm quilts tucked around her shoulders, sunlight streaming through clean windows. Then memory returned in a rush, and she sat up quickly, her heart racing as she remembered where she was and what she'd confessed the night before. The small bedroom was spartanly furnished, but comfortable. Thomas had given her his bed, while he took the sofa near the fire, a gesture of courtesy that had surprised her. Vincent would never have given up his comfort for anyone, especially not for her. The thought of her dead husband sent a familiar twist of guilt through her stomach, but it was accompanied now by something else, a strange sense of relief that felt almost like freedom. She dressed quickly in the same clothes she'd worn for 3 days, wishing desperately for something clean. Her reflection in the small mirror, above the wash basin, showed a woman she barely recognized, hollow-cheeked and wild-haired, with shadows under her eyes that spoke of more than just lost sleep. The bruises on her throat had faded further but were still visible, yellow-green reminders of Vincent's final rage. The main room was empty when she emerged, though the fire had been recently stoked and coffee waited in the pot on the stove. Through the window, she could see Thomas in the yard, splitting logs with methodical precision. His movements were economical and practiced. the heavy axe rising and falling in a steady rhythm that spoke of years of mountain living. Sarah poured herself coffee and stood at the window watching him work. In daylight he appeared older than she'd first thought, perhaps 45 or 50, with the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from honest labor under open sky. There was something deeply calming about his presence, a steadiness that she'd never experienced with Vincent's unpredictable moods. He must have sensed her watching, because he paused in his work and looked toward the cabin. When he saw her in the window, he raised one hand in greeting, then buried the axe in the chopping block and started toward the house. Sarah stepped back instinctively, suddenly nervous about facing him in daylight after her confession. The door opened with a gust of cold air, and Thomas stomped his boots on the threshold before entering. "Morning," he said, hanging his coat on its peg. "Sleep well?" "Yes, thank you." She hesitated, then added, "I hope the sofa wasn't too uncomfortable. I've slept in worse places." He moved to the stove and poured his own coffee, his movements relaxed and unhurried. "How are you feeling? More yourself today?" It was a simple question, but it made Sarah pause. Was she more herself today? She wasn't sure she remembered who herself was anymore. For 2 years she'd been Vincent's wife, defined by his needs and his anger. Before that, she'd been her father's daughter, dutiful and obedient. She couldn't remember the last time someone had asked about her feelings as if they genuinely mattered. "I'm better," she said finally. "Thank you for everything. The food, the bed, listening to what I told you without—" She struggled for words. "Without judging me." Thomas settled into one of the chairs at the table, gesturing for her to do the same. "Judgment's a luxury I can't afford up here. Man judges too. Quick, he might miss something important, like the difference between a killer and someone who had to kill to survive." Sarah took the offered seat, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup for warmth and comfort. "How can you be so certain I'm not just a killer? You don't know anything about me, about what really happened." "I know enough." Thomas studied her, over the rim of his cup. "I know you've been beaten, and recently. I know you're running scared, but you're not running wild. You didn't take anything that wasn't yours, didn't hurt anyone who didn't hurt you first. And I know you're carrying guilt that's eating you alive, which tells me whatever you didn't do it easy." His assessment was so accurate it made her chest tighten. "Vincent, my husband, he wasn't always violent. When we first married, he was different, gentle even. But the drinking got worse, and his temper with it, and I—" She stopped, unsure how much to reveal. "You stayed because you thought you could save him," Thomas said quietly. "Or because you thought you deserved what he gave you, or because you didn't see any other choice. Probably all three." Sarah nodded, tears threatening. He'd been drinking all day at Henderson's saloon. Came home spoiling for a fight. And when I tried to avoid him, her hand went unconsciously to her throat. He said I was planning to leave him, that he'd kill me before he'd let that happen. And I believed him. "So you defended yourself." "I grabbed a knife from the kitchen counter. I didn't think, just instinct, I suppose. It went in so easily, like cutting through butter." She shuddered at the memory. "He looked so surprised, like he couldn't believe I'd finally fought back." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup. When he spoke, his voice was matter-of-fact rather than sympathetic. "What will you do now? You can't go. Back and they'll be looking for you in all the usual places." The practical question helped ground her, pulled her out of the spiral of memory and guilt. "I don't know. I have some money, enough to get me started somewhere new if I can get far. Enough away. Maybe California or Oregon Territory, somewhere I can disappear." $23 won't get you to California," Thomas said, and Sarah started in surprise. She hadn't told him how much money she carried. You counted while I was sleeping? I checked your bag for weapons, yes. Found the money, the knife, and not much else. You planning to walk to California carrying nothing but the clothes on your back? His tone was challenging but not unkind, and Sarah realized he was right. Her escape plan was born of desperation rather than logic. I hadn't thought that far ahead. I was just trying to get away from him, from what I'd done. Winter's coming on fast up here. In a month, maybe less, these passes will be snowed in until spring. You want to get anywhere, you'll need to move soon, and you'll need help. Hope flickered in Sarah's chest, dangerous and fragile. Are you offering to help me? Thomas set down his cup and leaned back in his chair, studying her with those sharp eyes. Might be. Depends on whether you're willing to earn it. I'll do whatever you ask, Sarah said quickly. Cooking, cleaning, mending. I'm a hard worker, I promise. I'm sure you are. But that's not what I'm talking about. Thomas rose and moved to the window, looking out at the mountains that surrounded his small clearing. Winter's a hard time to live alone up here. Gets so quiet a man starts talking to himself just to hear a human voice. I could use the company, and you could use a place to hide while you figure out what comes next. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. You're saying I could stay through the winter? I'm saying we could help each other. You keep me from going completely mad from solitude. I keep you alive until spring. Come thaw, if you still want to head for California or wherever, I'll help you get there with supplies and a proper outfit. But if you stay, it has to be as an equal partner, not as hired help or charity case. The offer was more generous than anything she'd dared hope for, but something in his tone made her wary. What aren't you telling me? Thomas turned from the window, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked uncertain. Living through a mountain winter isn't easy under the best circumstances. Storms can last for days. Temperatures drop so low you can't go outside without risking frostbite, and supplies have to last months without possibility of replenishment. It requires trust, absolute trust, between partners. If we're going to do this, we need to be honest with each other about everything. Everything. I need to know exactly what happened with your husband, what the law might be thinking, who might come looking for you. And you need to know why a man my age is living alone in the mountains instead of in town with a proper wife and family. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. What do you mean? Thomas returned to his chair, his movements suddenly heavy. I mean, I've got my own reasons for preferring solitude, my own past that doesn't bear too much scrutiny. If we're going to winter together, you should know what kind of man you're trusting your life to. The words hung between them like a challenge. Sarah studied his face, trying to read the secrets hidden behind his steady gaze. Everything rational told her to be cautious, to demand answers before committing to anything. But her alternatives were limited. Return to the wilderness and almost certain death, or try to reach civilization with no supplies, and winter coming on fast. Tell me, she said simply. Thomas was quiet for so long that Sarah wondered if he'd changed his mind about confessing. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, as if he were recounting someone else's story. I was married once. Her name was Catherine, and she was the finest woman who ever drew breath. We had a good life in Denver. I was a lawyer then, if you can believe that. Respectable profession, respectable house, everything a man was supposed to want. He paused, his fingers drumming against the table. Catherine died in childbirth along with our son. Fever took them both while I sat helpless beside the bed, watching everything I cared about slip away. After the funeral, I started drinking. Lost my practice, then my house, then what little sense I had left. Sarah said nothing, recognizing the particular pain that came with losing the people who mattered most. One night I was in a saloon, drunk and spoiling for trouble, when a young man, barely more than a boy really, made some comment about my condition. I took offense and challenged him to step outside. He probably weighed 130 pounds soaking wet, but pride makes fools of us all. Thomas's hands had stilled, and Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders. I beat him nearly to death with my bare hands, broke his jaw, his ribs, probably gave him brain damage that would affect him for the rest of his life, all because a grieving drunk couldn't stand to hear the truth about what he'd become. Did he die? Sarah whispered. No, but he might as well have. Last I heard, he couldn't work, couldn't take care of himself properly. His family had to sell their farm to pay for his medical care. Thomas met her eyes, and she saw the weight of old guilt there. I left Denver that night and came up here. That was 8 years ago, and I haven't been back to civilization since. Sarah absorbed this confession, turning it over in her mind. It was a hard story, ugly in its honesty, but she found she wasn't afraid of him. If anything, his willingness to share his shame made her trust him more. Do you regret it? She asked. Coming here? Living alone? The isolation. No. The beating? He shrugged. Regret won't undo what I did. Won't give that boy his health back or his family their farm. All I can do is try to be better than what I was. And you think helping me is part of being better? I think we all deserve a chance to start over, to prove we're more than the worst thing we've ever done. You killed a man who was trying to kill you. That's not the same as what I did, but the running, the guilt, the feeling like you're carrying poison in your blood. I understand that. Sarah considered his words, his offer, the implications of spending months alone with a man she'd known for less than 24 hours. It was risky, potentially dangerous, but it was also the first real hope she'd had since Vincent fell bleeding on their kitchen floor. If I stay, she said slowly, what would you expect from me? I mean, what kind of arrangement? Nothing improper, Thomas said quickly, understanding her concern. Separate sleeping quarters, no obligations beyond partnership. I'm not looking for a replacement wife, and I imagine you're not eager to trust another man after what you've been through. Then what do you get out of it? Why take the risk? Thomas was quiet for a moment, looking into the fire as if searching for the right words. Maybe because I'm tired of being alone with my guilt. Maybe because helping you feels like a way to balance the scales, just a little. Or maybe because it's been 8 years since I had a conversation with someone who didn't echo back from the mountainside. Despite everything, Sarah found herself smiling at that last comment. You really do talk to yourself up here? More than I'd care to admit. The horses are good listeners, but they're terrible conversationalists. The moment of levity broke some of the tension between them, and Sarah felt the tight knots in her chest begin to loosen. This strange man, with his honest confessions and steady presence, was offering her something she'd never had: partnership without ownership, shelter without strings attached. All right, she said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. I'll stay, but I want to earn my keep, and I want your word that when spring comes, you'll help me get wherever I need to go. You have it. Thomas extended his hand across the table, and after a moment's hesitation, Sarah shook it. His grip was firm and warm, calloused from honest work. Partners, then, he said. Partners, Sarah agreed, and for the first time since Vincent's death, she felt like she might actually survive what came next. 2 weeks passed before Sarah realized she'd stopped flinching every time Thomas moved too quickly. The transformation had been so gradual that she hadn't noticed it happening, the way her shoulders no longer hunched when he reached past her for something, how she'd begun sleeping through the night without jerking awake at every sound. For the first time in years, her body was learning what it felt like to exist without constant vigilance. The cabin had developed a rhythm that suited them both. Thomas rose before dawn to tend the animals, 2 horses, a milk cow, and a small flock of chickens that somehow survived the mountain winters in their well-insulated coop. Sarah had taken over the cooking, finding genuine pleasure in preparing. Meals for someone who appreciated her efforts without criticism or complaint. Vincent had found fault with everything she'd put before him, but Thomas praised her biscuits, asked for seconds of her stew, and thanked her after every meal as if she'd done something remarkable. She'd also claimed responsibility for maintaining the cabin's interior, though it required little work. Thomas was naturally neat, his possessions few and well cared for. Still, she swept and dusted with methodical thoroughness, taking satisfaction in the small improvements she could make, arranging his books by subject rather than height, mending a curtain that had torn in the wind, organizing his medical supplies into a proper kit after discovering his haphazard attempts at self-doctoring. This morning, I found her in the root cellar, taking inventory of their food stores. Thomas had laid in supplies for one person through the winter, but feeding two would require careful rationing. She made notes on a piece of bark paper, calculating portions and planning meals that would stretch their resources without leaving either of them hungry. The cellar was carved directly into the mountainside behind the cabin, its walls lined with stone to keep the temperature constant. Barrels of salted pork and flour stood alongside sacks of beans and dried corn. Glass jars filled with preserved vegetables crowded wooden shelves, their contents glowing like jewels in the lamplight. Thomas had done well for himself up here, she thought. This wasn't the rough existence of a hermit, but the careful preparation of a man who understood what mountain winters demanded. She was counting jars of pickled cabbage when she heard voices outside. Thomas talking to someone in the yard. Sarah froze, her heart immediately racing as fear crashed over her like ice water. In 2 weeks of isolation, they hadn't seen another soul. Who would come calling this far into the mountains, and what did they want? Moving carefully in the darkness, she climbed the cellar steps and pressed her ear to the door. Thomas's voice was calm but cautious, and she could hear another man speaking, though she couldn't make out words. After a few minutes, the conversation ended and footsteps approached the cabin. Sarah hurried inside through the back door, trying to look occupied with ordinary tasks when Thomas entered. But her hands shook as she set down the lamp, and she knew her fear must be written plainly across her face. "Who was that?" she asked, attempting to keep her voice level. "Jake Morrison, from down in Pine Creek. He's heading to Butte for the winter, and stopped to check if I needed anything before the passes close." Thomas hung his coat on its peg, his movements deliberate and reassuring. "I told him I was well supplied and looking forward to a quiet winter." Did he ask about me? He saw smoke from the chimney and wondered if I had company. I said, "My cousin from back east was visiting, recovering from a recent illness." Thomas met her eyes, his expression gentle but serious. He didn't seem suspicious, just neighborly, but it's a reminder that we need to be careful. Word travels fast in small communities, even when folks are scattered across 50 miles of mountains. Sarah nodded, though her pulse still hammered in her throat. "Do you think he believed you?" "No reason not to. Jake's a good man. Mine's his. Own business mostly. But he'll mention seeing me in Pine Creek, and people will remember that Thomas Whitmore had family visiting. It's actually good cover for us. Explains why someone might have seen you without raising questions about where you came from." The logical explanation helped calm her nerves, but Sarah realized how isolated she'd allowed herself to become in just 2 weeks. The outside world, with its laws and consequences and searching eyes, felt almost mythical compared to the insular safety of the cabin. She'd begun to think of this place as existing outside normal time and space, where past actions couldn't reach and future reckonings never came due. "I've been thinking," Thomas said, settling into his chair by the fire, "about your situation, what happens when spring comes. There are things we should discuss while we have time to plan properly." Sarah took the chair across from him, noting, How this position, facing each other across the hearth, had become their natural arrangement for serious conversations. What kind of things? Well, assuming you still want to leave come thaw, you'll need more than traveling clothes and road money. You'll need a new identity, papers that won't connect you to what happened in Montana Territory. And you'll need skills that can support you wherever you end up. The practicality of his planning both impressed and sobered her. While she'd been learning to live without fear, he'd been thinking ahead to the challenges that awaited beyond these mountains. How would I get new papers? I don't even know what name I'd use. There are people who can help with that for a price, but first you need to decide who you want to become. Thomas leaned forward, his expression intent. What did you do before you married? What were you good at? Sarah had to think about that. Her life with Vincent had consumed so much of who she was that she'd almost forgotten the person she'd been before. I taught school for 2 years after I finished my education. I was good with the children, good at making lessons interesting. But that was in Indiana before we moved west. Teaching's a respectable profession for a woman, and teachers are needed everywhere the frontier's expanding. With some preparation, you could present yourself as an experienced educator looking for a position in California or Oregon. The idea sparked something in Sarah that she hadn't felt in years, a sense of possibility, of having a future that belonged to her rather than being defined by someone else's needs or anger. You think I could do that? Just start over as someone completely new. People reinvent themselves all the time out here. The frontier's full of second chances for those brave enough to take them. Thomas smiled, and she saw approval in his eyes. You've already proven you're braver than you knew. The rest is just details. They spent the afternoon discussing specifics. What name she might choose, what story she'd tell about her background, how she'd explain her journey west without a husband or family. Thomas had a practical knowledge of frontier life that surprised her, and she realized he'd probably helped other people disappear into new lives during his years in these mountains. Have you done this before? She asked as they worked together. To prepare dinner. Helped someone start over. Thomas paused in his stirring of the evening stew. Once or twice. Mountain folk tend to be running from something, and sometimes they need help figuring out where to run to next. What about you? Do you ever think about starting over somewhere new? The question seemed to surprise him. I suppose I thought this was my new start. Come up here, live quietly, try not to do any more harm than I already had. But don't you get lonely? Don't you want more than just surviving? Thomas considered this while he added herbs to the pot. I got used to the loneliness, made peace with it, figured it was what I deserved after what I'd done. But having you here... He stopped, as if realizing he'd revealed more than he intended. Having me here, what? Makes me remember what it was like to live instead of just exist. Makes me think maybe I've been hiding instead of healing. The admission hung between them, vulnerable and honest. Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire or the food or the shelter he'd provided. For weeks they'd been partners in survival, but this felt like something deeper, a recognition of kinship that went beyond their shared need for refuge. I've been thinking the same thing, she said softly, about living versus existing. Vincent used to say I was already half dead, that I moved through life like a ghost. I hated him for saying it, but he wasn't wrong. And now... Sarah looked around the cabin that had become her sanctuary, at the man who'd offered her partnership without ownership, safety without surrender. Now I feel like I'm waking up from a long sleep, like maybe the person I was supposed to be was buried under all that fear and anger, but she's still there. That evening, they sat together reading by lamplight, a companionable silence settling between them. Thomas had lent her a volume of poetry, Whitman, which she'd never been allowed to read because Vincent considered it improper for women. Now she lost herself in verses about open roads and democratic vistas, about the dignity of ordinary labor and the poetry of American voices. "Listen to this," she said, finding a passage that resonated. "Song of the open road. Henceforth I ask, not good fortune, I myself am good fortune. Henceforth I whimper no more, postpone no more, need nothing, done with indoor complaints, libraries, querulous criticisms, strong and content I travel the open road." Thomas looked up from his own. A book, a technical manual about crop rotation that seemed an odd choice for a mountain hermit. "You like Whitman?" "I think I do." Vincent would have been scandalized. He said poetry was just pretty words for people too lazy to speak plainly, but this feels different, like someone putting into words what it means to be truly free. Whitman understood that freedom isn't something someone gives you. It's something you claim for yourself, consequences be damned. Sarah nodded, thinking of the kitchen knife in her hand, of the choice between Vincent's life and her own. Even when claiming it costs everything you thought you were. Especially then. Later, as she prepared for bed in the small room that had become hers, Sarah caught her reflection in the mirror again. The hollow-cheeked stranger was still there, but she could see changes that had nothing to do with regular meals or sufficient sleep. There was color in her face again, a directness in her gaze that spoke of someone remembering her own worth. She thought about Jake Morrison's visit, about the reminder that the outside world still existed beyond their mountain sanctuary. Soon enough she'd have to rejoin that world, to test whether the strength she was building here could survive contact with law and society, and the judgments of strangers. But for the first time since Vincent's death, she felt ready for that challenge. Tomorrow she would ask Thomas to teach her to shoot. If she was going to travel alone across dangerous country, she needed to know how to protect herself properly. She'd killed once, with a kitchen knife in desperate self-defense. She wouldn't be caught helpless again. The thought should have frightened her, but instead it felt like another step toward the person she was becoming. Someone who could look danger in the eye and stand her ground. Someone who understood that survival sometimes required violence, but refused to let that knowledge poison her spirit. Outside, the wind picked up, howling around the cabin's corners with the promise of harder weather to come. But inside, Sarah felt warm and safe and purposeful. She was learning to live again, learning what it meant to be a partner rather than property, an equal rather than a victim. And for the first time since she could remember, she was looking forward to tomorrow. The first blizzard of the season hit. 3 weeks later, with a fury that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain, Sarah woke to complete darkness and the sound of wind howling like something alive and angry, driving snow against the windows with such force that the glass rattled in its frames. The temperature had dropped so dramatically overnight that frost covered the inside of the windows in intricate patterns that would have been beautiful under other circumstances. She dressed quickly in the dim light of early dawn, pulling on the wool stockings and heavy boots Thomas had procured for her from his winter supplies. The main room was bitterly cold, despite the banked fire, and she could see her breath as she moved to rekindle the flames. Thomas was already up, fully dressed, and checking the seals around the door and windows for drafts that could prove deadly if left unaddressed. "How long will this last?" she asked, joining him at the window where they could barely see 3 feet beyond the glass through the driving snow. "Could be hours, could be days. These mountain storms don't follow any schedule but their own." Thomas moved to the stove and began preparing coffee, his movements efficient despite the cold. "Good thing we finished bringing in the firewood yesterday. We're going to need every stick of it." They'd spent the previous day in frantic preparation as the barometric pressure dropped and the animals grew restless with the approaching storm. Sarah had helped Thomas secure everything that could blow away, reinforce the chicken coop against the wind, and move a week's worth of split wood into the cabin itself. Now she was grateful for his foresight as she listened to trees groaning and occasionally crashing somewhere in the whiteout beyond their walls. The storm raged for 3 days. Without pause, they rationed candles and lamp oil, moving through the cabin like ghosts in the dim light to conserve their supplies. Sarah found herself grateful for Thomas's steady presence as the isolation pressed in around them. Without him, she thought she might have gone mad from the combination of claustrophobia and the storm's relentless noise. On the 4th morning, she woke to silence so profound it was almost shocking. The wind had died sometime during the night, and pale sunlight filtered through windows completely obscured by snow. Thomas was already up, digging out the front door with a wooden shovel. He'd stored inside for exactly this purpose. "We need to check the animals," he said when she joined him. 3 days without proper care, they could be in bad shape. The world that greeted them outside was transformed beyond recognition. Snow had drifted against the cabin in places higher than Sarah's head, and the familiar landscape of yard and outbuildings was buried under sculpted white hills that bore no resemblance to what had been there before. The cold was so intense it made her lungs ache with each breath, and she pulled her borrowed coat closer around her body. The chicken coop had survived, though the birds were huddled together for warmth and clearly distressed. The horses and cow were alive but hungry, their eyes reflecting relief when Thomas and Sarah appeared with hay and grain. As they worked together to restore normal care routines, Sarah marveled at how the storm had created a world within a world, where their small cabin felt like the only warm, living thing left on Earth. "This is nothing compared to what January and February will bring," Thomas told her as they made their way back to the cabin, their feet crunching through snow that came up to their knees. "The real test is still ahead." That afternoon, as they sat warming themselves by the fire and taking inventory of supplies used during the storm, they heard something that made them both freeze, the distant sound of horses approaching through the snow. Thomas was on his feet instantly, moving to the window and peering out through a gap he'd cleared in the accumulated frost. "3 riders," he said, his voice tight with concern. "Coming up the trail from the south." Sarah felt her blood turn to ice. No one traveled mountain trails in winter unless driven by desperate necessity, and the only people who might be desperate enough to seek her out were those with the authority to arrest her for Vincent's murder. She moved to Thomas's side, trying to see through the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. The riders were still distant, black shapes moving slowly through the white landscape, but they were definitely heading toward the cabin. Sarah could make out at least one figure that seemed to be wearing some kind of official-looking coat, and the lead rider sat his horse with the straight-backed posture of someone accustomed to authority. "Sheriff?" she whispered. "Likely." Thomas stepped back from the window, his expression grim but determined. "Get your things together, quickly. There's a back way out through the root cellar that connects to an old mine shaft. You can follow it down the mountain and—" "No." The word came out more firmly than Sarah had intended, surprising them both. "I'm not running anymore." Thomas stared at her. "Sarah, if that's a sheriff's posse out there, they're not coming for a social visit. They'll arrest you for murder and drag you back to face a hangman's noose. Maybe, or maybe it's time I stopped living like a fugitive and started living like someone who did what she had to do to survive." Sarah moved away from the window, her mind working quickly through options and consequences. "You said to yourself that I defended myself. Maybe it's time to make that argument to someone besides you." A legal argument requires lawyers and judges who believe in justice over convenience. Out here, frontier justice usually means finding someone to blame and hanging them quick before winter sets in, and people lose interest. Sarah knew he was right, but something deep inside her had shifted during their weeks together in the cabin. The frightened woman who had stumbled out of the forest 6 weeks ago was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and refused to spend the rest of her life hiding from the consequences of saving her own life. Then I'll make them understand, she said. I'll tell them what Vincent was, what he did, what he was going to do. And if they don't believe me, at least I'll face it standing up instead of running like a guilty thing. Thomas studied her face, and she could see him recognizing the same transformation she felt within herself. This wasn't the desperate, broken woman he'd found bleeding and terrified in his clearing. This was someone who had remembered what it felt like to have value, to deserve protection, to be worth defending. If you're determined to stay and face this, then we do it together, he said finally. Partners, remember? That means I don't abandon you when things get difficult. Thomas, you could be arrested too for harboring a fugitive. You don't owe me that kind of loyalty. I don't owe it, no, but I choose to give it. His voice was steady, resolute. Besides, you're not a fugitive. You're a woman who defended herself against a man who was trying to kill her. There's a difference, and it's time someone made that distinction clear to the law. The riders were close enough now that Sarah could make out details. A man wearing a sheriff's star, another who looked like a deputy, and a third who's civilian. Clothes suggested he might be a local citizen, recruited for the posse. They approached the cabin cautiously, hands resting near their weapons but not drawn, eyes scanning the area for signs of danger or escape routes. Thomas opened the door before they could knock, stepping onto the porch with his hands visible and empty. Sarah remained just inside the doorway, close enough to be seen, but far enough back to avoid seeming threatening. "Gentlemen," Thomas said, his voice calm and polite, "what brings you up the mountain in weather like this?" The sheriff was a middle-aged man with graying hair and eyes that had seen too much of human nature to be easily fooled. His gaze moved from Thomas to Sarah, taking in her appearance with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating potential criminals. "I'm Sheriff William Crawford from Pine Creek. This is Deputy Martinez and citizen volunteer George Henley. We're looking for a woman named Sarah Monroe, wanted in connection with the death of Vincent Harlow 6 weeks ago." Crawford's voice was professionally neutral, but Sarah could hear the underlying steel. "We have reason to believe she might have sought shelter in this area." "Sarah Monroe," Thomas repeated thoughtfully, as if testing the name. "Can't say I know anyone by that name. What's she supposed to have done?" "Killed her husband with a kitchen knife, then fled the scene, left him bleeding to death on their kitchen floor." Deputy Martinez spoke up, his tone suggesting he'd already decided Sarah's guilt. Neighbors heard them fighting, saw her running from the house with blood on her hands. Sarah felt anger flare in her chest at the oversimplified version of events, but she forced herself to remain calm. This was her moment to speak for herself, to present her side of the story to representatives of the law for the first time since Vincent's death. "I'm Sarah Monroe," she said, stepping forward onto the porch. "And I did kill Vincent Harlow, but not the way you're making it sound." All three men tensed, hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. Sheriff Crawford raised one hand to stop his companions from drawing, his eyes fixed on Sarah with sharp attention. "Ma'am, I need to advise you that anything you say can be used against you in a court of law. You're under arrest for the murder of Vincent Harlow." Crawford began to reach for his handcuffs, but Thomas stepped slightly between him and Sarah. "Hold on, Sheriff. You said you wanted her in connection with his death, not that you had evidence she murdered him. Seems like you ought to hear what she has to say before you start assuming guilt." "The evidence is pretty clear, sir. Dead husband, missing wife with blood on her hands. Doesn't take much detective work to piece that together." "Evidence of death, yes. Evidence of murder." Thomas shook his head. "Man kills his wife, that's murder. Wife kills her husband after. He beats her and threatens to kill her. That might be something else entirely." Sheriff Crawford paused, his hand still resting on his handcuffs. Sarah could see him weighing options, considering whether Thomas's words held enough truth to warrant further investigation. "You're saying he was violent toward her?" I'm saying you ought to look at her throat, Sheriff. Look at the bruises that were fresh when she arrived here 6 weeks ago. Look at the fear in her eyes when she talks about going back. Then ask yourself whether a woman defending her life deserves the same treatment as a cold-blooded killer. Sarah pulled down the collar of her coat, exposing her neck, where Vincent's fingerprints had faded, but were still faintly visible as yellowish shadows against her pale skin. She saw Crawford's expression shift slightly as he registered the evidence of strangulation, and Deputy Martinez shifted uncomfortably. Bruises could come from anywhere, Martinez said, but his voice lacked conviction. Could? Crawford agreed slowly. But they usually don't wrap around a woman's throat in finger-shaped patterns unless someone was trying to choke the life out of her. He looked directly at Sarah. Ma'am, I need to hear your version of what happened that night. All of it, from the beginning. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of 6 weeks' worth of running and hiding and guilt settling on her shoulders. This was the moment she'd been dreading and preparing for in equal measure, the chance to tell the truth and trust that justice might still exist in a world that had given her precious little reason to believe in it. Vincent came home drunk and angry the way he did most nights, but this time was different. This time he said he was going to kill me, and I believed him. She kept her voice steady, matter-of-fact, letting the simple truth carry its own weight. He put his hands around my throat and started squeezing. I couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but grab for the knife that was on the counter behind me. When I stabbed him, it was because I knew if I didn't, I was going to die right there on my own kitchen floor. Any witnesses to this alleged attack? Martinez asked skeptically. Who witnesses a man beating his wife in their own home, Deputy? You think Vincent advertised his cruelty to the neighbors? Thomas's voice carried an edge of contempt. You think a woman stays with a violent man because she enjoys it or because she's been convinced that no one will believe her if she speaks up? Sheriff Crawford studied Sarah's face with the careful attention of someone trying to read truth from lies. How long had he been violent toward you, Mrs. Monroe? 2 years, since about 6 months after we married. It started with slapping when he'd been drinking, then progressing to worse things as time went on. Sarah found it easier to talk about now, as if the weeks with Thomas had drained some of the shame from the memories. He broke my ribs once, blackened both my eyes more times than I can count, but he was always sorry afterward, always promised to change. Did you ever report these incidents to the authorities? Sarah almost laughed at the question. Sheriff, you tell me, if I'd come to your office with bruises and claimed my husband was beating me, what would you have done? Arrested a prominent man on the word of his wife? Or told me that marriage troubles should be worked out at home? Crawford's silence was answer enough, and Sarah could see the uncomfortable recognition in his eyes. They all knew how domestic violence was typically handled by frontier law, ignored, minimized, dismissed as private family matters beyond the reach of official intervention. Even if we accept that he was violent, Martinez said, clearly reluctant, to abandon his original assumptions, that doesn't give you the right to kill him. You could have left, could have sought help. With what money, what skills, where would I go that he couldn't follow me? Sarah felt her anger rising again, the familiar frustration of trying to explain realities that men like Martinez refused to understand. You think leaving an abusive husband is like walking away from a bad job. You think women like me have endless options for survival. The point is, Thomas interjected, she didn't plan to kill him. She defended herself in a moment when her life was directly threatened. That's not murder, Sheriff. That's justifiable homicide under any reasonable interpretation of the law. Crawford removed his hat and ran a hand through his graying hair, clearly wrestling with the gap between the straightforward case he'd expected to find and the complex reality he was confronting. Ma'am, even if I believe your story, and I'm not saying I don't, there's still the matter of you fleeing the scene. Innocent people don't usually run from the law. Innocent people don't usually trust the law to protect them when they've been failed by it repeatedly, Sarah replied. I ran because I was terrified, because I knew that a dead husband and a living wife equals guilty until proven innocent in most courtrooms. I ran because I'd rather die free in these mountains than hang for the crime of saving my own life. The four words hung in the cold air between them, crystallizing the fundamental question that lay at the heart of her case. Whether a woman's right to defend herself could overcome the legal and social presumptions that made her automatically suspect when a man died by her hand. Sheriff Crawford looked between Sarah and Thomas, clearly weighing his options and their potential consequences. Mrs. Monroe, I'm afraid I still have to arrest you, but I'm willing to present all the facts to the judge, including your claims of self-defense. Whether he believes them or not, that's not my decision to make. Sarah nodded, having expected this outcome even while hoping for better. I understand, Sheriff, but I want it noted that I'm surrendering voluntarily, that I'm not resisting arrest or trying to flee. I want to face this legally and properly. Ma'am, I'll note that in my report. Crawford produced his handcuffs, but his movements were gentle, almost apologetic. I'm sorry it has to be this way. As the cold metal closed around her wrists, Sarah felt a strange sense of relief mixed with her fear. For 6 weeks, she'd been running from this moment, and now that it had arrived, she discovered that facing the truth was less terrifying than hiding from it had been. Thomas stepped forward as Crawford began to lead her toward the horses. Sheriff, I'll be riding into Pine Creek within the week to testify on her behalf. I'm a witness to her condition when she arrived here, and I have some experience with legal matters that might be relevant. Crawford nodded. You're welcome to speak to the judge, sir, though I should warn you that harboring a fugitive is itself a serious charge. She wasn't a fugitive, Thomas replied firmly. She was a woman seeking sanctuary after defending her life. There's a distinction, and I'll make sure the court understands it. As they prepared to leave, Sarah looked back at the cabin that had become her sanctuary, at the man who had shown her what partnership and respect could look like. Whatever happened next, she would face it as someone who had remembered her own worth, someone who refused to apologize for refusing to die. The wind was picking up again as they rode down the mountain trail, carrying the promise of more snow. But Sarah found herself unafraid of whatever storms lay ahead. The Pine Creek jail was a cramped, windowless cell carved into the stone foundation of the sheriff's office, cold enough that Sarah's breath formed clouds in the stale air. She'd been there for 4 days, marking time by the meals Deputy Martinez brought her. Watery soup and hard bread that spoke more of neglect than malice. The isolation was the hardest part, the way silence pressed against her ears until she found herself straining to hear any sound from the world above. On the 5th morning, Sheriff Crawford appeared outside her cell with a ring of keys and an expression she couldn't quite read. Mrs. Monroe, Judge Hamilton wants to see you. We're going upstairs for a preliminary hearing. Sarah rose from the narrow cot where she'd been lying, her muscles stiff from cold and inactivity. A hearing? I thought there would be a trial first. Judge wants to hear your story before he decides whether this case warrants a full trial or if it can be resolved more simply. Crawford unlocked the cell door, his movements careful but not unkind. Your friend Mr. Whitmore arrived yesterday with some interesting information. Seems he's been busy since we took you in. Hope flickered in Sarah's chest as Crawford led her up the wooden stairs to the main floor of the sheriff's office. Through the windows, she could see Pine Creek's main street, busy with the morning activities of a frontier town. Merchants opening their shops, horses and wagons moving goods, children running between buildings with the casual freedom she'd almost forgotten existed. The courthouse was a single large room, above Henderson's general store, furnished with mismatched chairs and a scarred wooden table that served as the judge's bench. Judge Hamilton was a thin, stern-faced man with wire spectacles and the careful posture of someone who'd spent decades making difficult decisions. Thomas sat in the front row of chairs, dressed in his best clothes and holding a leather portfolio that looked official and important. Also present were Deputy Martinez, George Henley from the original posse, and 3 people Sarah didn't recognize: a well-dressed woman who might have been a teacher or shopkeeper, an elderly man with calloused hands that suggested manual labor, and a younger man wearing the collar of a minister. All of them watched her with the intense curiosity of people who'd heard her story second-hand and wanted to judge its truth for themselves. "Mrs. Monroe," Judge Hamilton said, as Crawford guided her to a chair facing the bench, "I've called this hearing to determine whether the charges against you warrant proceeding to trial, or whether the circumstances of Vincent Harlow's death suggest a different interpretation of events." Sarah nodded, her throat too dry for speech. She could feel the weight of every gaze in the room, the collective attention of people whose decision would determine whether she lived or died. "Mr. Whitmore has presented me with some compelling information regarding your situation, but I want to hear your account directly from you. Tell me what happened the night Vincent Harlow died, and don't leave out any details you think might be relevant." Sarah took a deep breath, drawing on the strength she'd found during her weeks with Thomas. "Your Honor, Vincent had been drinking at Henderson's saloon for most of the day. When he came home that evening, he was drunk and angry about something. I never knew what set him off. It could be anything or nothing. Had you argued that day?" "No, sir. I'd spent the day washing clothes and preparing his dinner. When he walked through the door, I could see the rage in his eyes, but I tried to avoid confrontation by staying busy in the kitchen." Judge Hamilton made notes on a piece of paper, his pen scratching loudly in the quiet room. "Continue." He demanded to know why dinner wasn't on the table, even though it was still an hour before he usually ate. "When I explained that I'd been waiting for him to come home, he accused me of lying, of making excuses." Sarah's voice grew steadier as she spoke, the words she'd rehearsed in her mind, taking on the rhythm of truth. "That's when he grabbed my wrist and twisted it behind my back, the way he'd done before when he wanted to hurt me without leaving visible marks." "You say, the way he'd done before. Are you claiming this was part of a pattern of violence?" "Yes, sir. Vincent had been hitting me for nearly 2 years, ever since about 6 months after our wedding. It started with slapping when he'd been drinking, but it got progressively worse over time." Thomas stood up from his seat. "Your Honor, may I present evidence that supports Mrs. Monroe's claims?" Judge Hamilton nodded, and Thomas approached the bench with his portfolio. "I've gathered statements from 3 residents of Pine Creek who witnessed evidence of Vincent Harlow's violence toward his wife, though they didn't feel comfortable reporting it at the time." He handed several papers to the judge, who read them with growing attention. Sarah saw the woman she'd noticed earlier nod slightly when the judge glanced in her direction, and she realized this must be one of the witnesses Thomas had found. "Mrs. Elizabeth Garrett," the judge read aloud, "states that she observed Mrs. Monroe in Henderson's store on September 15th with visible bruises on her face and arms, and that when asked about them, Mrs. Monroe claimed to have fallen downstairs. Mrs. Garrett notes that Mrs. Monroe seemed nervous and frightened, especially when her husband's name was mentioned." Sarah remembered that day. Vincent had beaten her the night before for burning his breakfast, and she'd been forced to go to town for supplies despite the obvious marks on her face. She'd invented the story about falling, knowing that no one would believe the truth or do anything about it if they did. Judge Hamilton continued reading. Reverend Michael Foster states that on October 2nd, he encountered Mrs. Monroe outside the church with what appeared to be finger-shaped bruises around her throat. When he offered assistance, she declined and hurried away, seeming frightened that someone might have seen them talking. The minister in the back row, Reverend Foster apparently, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, I regret not pressing the matter at the time. I suspected domestic violence but felt constrained by the belief that such matters were private family concerns. I've since reconsidered that position, and Mr. Jacob Henley," the judge read from the third statement, "reports observing Vincent Harlow on multiple occasions grabbing, pushing, or otherwise physically intimidating his wife in public settings. Mr. Henley notes that Mrs. Monroe appeared to live in constant fear of her husband's reactions. The elderly man, with calloused hands, Jacob Henley, George's father apparently, stood briefly. Judge, I seen that man treat his wife like she was his property to abuse as he pleased. Should have spoken up before now, but I figured it wasn't my business. I was wrong about that." Judge Hamilton set down the papers and looked directly at Sarah. "These statements suggest a pattern of abuse, Mrs. Monroe, but they don't explain what happened the night Vincent Harlow died. Continue with your account of that evening." Sarah nodded, feeling bolstered by the evidence that she hadn't been as alone or unnoticed as she'd believed. "After Vincent grabbed my wrist, I tried to pull away, but that only made him angrier. He started yelling about how I was planning to leave him, how I looked at other men, how I was an ungrateful wife who didn't appreciate what I had. Was there any truth to his accusations?" "No, sir. I'd never been unfaithful, never even considered it, but Vincent was jealous by nature, and alcohol made it worse. He saw threats and betrayals everywhere, even when they didn't exist." "What happened next?" Sarah closed her eyes, bringing back the memories she'd tried so hard to forget. "He pushed me against the kitchen counter, and that's when his hands went around my throat. He'd choked me before, but never like this. This time I could see in his eyes that he meant to finish it, that he wasn't going to stop until I was dead." "How can you be certain of his intent?" "Because he told me so. He said, 'I'll kill you before I let you leave me.' And then he squeezed. Harder. I couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but claw at his hands. The kitchen knife was on the counter behind me. I'd been using it to slice bread for his dinner. I grabbed it without thinking and thrust upward, trying to make him let go." Judge Hamilton leaned forward. "You're saying you stabbed him to make him release you, not necessarily to kill him?" "Yes, sir. I just wanted him to stop choking me so I could breathe again. When the knife went in, he stumbled backward and let go of my throat, but then he fell down, and I realized—" Sarah's voice broke slightly. "I realized I'd killed him." "What did you do then?" I panicked. I knew that a dead husband and a living wife would look like murder to anyone who found us, regardless of the circumstances, so I packed a bag and ran. Deputy Martinez spoke up from his position near the door. "Judge, even if we accept her story about being attacked, she still fled. The scene of a killing, that suggests consciousness of guilt." Thomas rose again. "Your Honor, it suggests consciousness of how domestic violence is typically treated by the justice system. Mrs. Monroe had every reason to believe that her word would count for nothing against the presumption that wives who kill their husbands are inherently guilty." Judge Hamilton considered this, his fingers drumming against the wooden table. "Mr. Whitmore, you've presented compelling evidence of abuse, but the law requires more than that to justify homicide. Can you demonstrate that Mrs. Monroe's life was truly in immediate danger?" Thomas opened his portfolio again and withdrew several more papers. "Your Honor, I've taken the liberty of consulting with Dr. Patrick Morrison in Butte City, who specializes in injuries related to strangulation. Based on his examination of the physical evidence and my description of Mrs. Monroe's condition when she arrived at my cabin, he's provided a medical opinion." He handed the papers to Judge Hamilton, who read them with careful attention. Sarah watched the judge's expression change as he absorbed whatever Dr. Morrison had concluded. Dr. Morrison states that the pattern and severity of bruising Mrs. Monroe exhibited were consistent with near-fatal strangulation, Judge Hamilton read aloud. He notes that such injuries typically result from sustained pressure lasting several minutes, during which the victim would experience genuine fear of imminent death. The judge looked up at Sarah. Mrs. Monroe, Dr. Morrison's report supports your claim that you were in immediate mortal danger. Combined with the evidence of ongoing abuse and the witness statements regarding your husband's violent behavior, I'm prepared to make a ruling on this matter. Sarah felt her heart racing as Judge Hamilton organized his papers and prepared to speak. Everything she'd endured, everything she'd fought for, came down to this moment and this man's interpretation of justice. The law recognizes that citizens have the right to defend themselves when faced with imminent threat of death or serious bodily harm. Judge Hamilton began, his voice carrying the formal weight of legal pronouncement. While the death of any person is tragic, the evidence presented suggests that Vincent Harlow's death resulted from Mrs. Monroe's reasonable and necessary response to a credible threat against her own life. Sarah felt tears begin to flow down her cheeks, though she wasn't sure yet whether they were tears of relief or fear. Furthermore, the judge continued, the pattern of abuse, documented by multiple witnesses, establishes that Mrs. Monroe had legitimate reason to fear for her safety when confronted by her husband's violence. Her decision to flee after the incident, while regrettable, is understandable given the historical reluctance of legal institutions to protect women in her situation. Judge Hamilton stood, his decision made. Therefore, I find that the death of Vincent Harlow constituted justifiable homicide in defense of life. The charges of murder against Mrs. Sarah Monroe are hereby dismissed. Mrs. Monroe, you are free to go. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, so unexpected and overwhelming that she nearly collapsed. Free. After months of running, weeks of hiding, days of imprisonment, she was free. Thomas was beside her in an instant, his steady presence grounding her as the reality of the judge's words sank in. Thank you, she whispered to Judge Hamilton, her voice barely audible. Thank you for listening, for believing me. Mrs. Monroe, the judge said, his stern expression softening slightly. I want you to understand that this ruling establishes precedent. Other women in similar situations will be able to point to this case as evidence that the law can protect them when they protect themselves. Your courage in facing these charges may save lives beyond your own. Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of responsibility that came with her freedom. She wasn't just Sarah Monroe anymore. She was a legal precedent, a symbol of what was possible. When women refused to accept violence as their inevitable fate, as the courtroom began to empty, Thomas placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. How does it feel? He asked. Like waking up from a nightmare, Sarah replied, looking around the room that had been the site of her liberation. Like discovering I'm stronger than I ever knew I could be. Sheriff Crawford approached them, his earlier antagonism replaced by something that might have been respect. Mrs. Monroe, I owe you an apology. I came into this case assuming guilt and looking for confirmation rather than truth. That was wrong, and I'm sorry. Thank you, Sheriff. That means more than you know. As they walked out of the courthouse into the bright mountain sunshine, Sarah felt a sense of completion that went beyond simple relief. She had faced the worst the world could throw at her and emerged not just intact, but transformed. The frightened woman who had stabbed her husband in desperate self-defense was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and would never again accept less than she deserved. What happens now? Thomas asked, as they stood together on Pine Creek's main street, breathing the crisp air of late autumn. Sarah looked around at the town that had witnessed her vindication, then up at the mountains that had sheltered her transformation. Now I get to decide who I want to become, instead of being told who I have to be. The future stretched ahead of her, uncertain but no longer terrifying. For the first time in her adult life, Sarah Monroe was truly free. Free from violence, free from fear, and free to write the next chapter of her story in her own words. The future stretched ahead of her, uncertain but no longer terrifying. For the first time in her adult life, Sarah Monroe was truly free. Free from violence, free from fear, and free to write the next chapter of her story in her own words. The courtroom began to empty as people filed out into the bright mountain afternoon, their conversations a mixture of surprise, approval, and lingering skepticism. Sarah remained seated for a moment, absorbing the magnitude of what had just occurred. She was free, not just legally, but psychologically and emotionally free in ways she was only beginning to understand. Thomas appeared beside her, offering his arm as she stood on legs that still trembled slightly from the intensity of the morning's proceedings. "How does it feel?" he asked softly. "Like waking up from a nightmare that lasted 2 years," Sarah replied, then paused to consider her words more carefully. "No, that's not quite right. Like discovering I'm stronger than the nightmare that tried to destroy me." Sheriff Crawford approached them as they prepared to leave, his expression thoughtful and somewhat humbled. "Mrs. Monroe, I want you to know that this case has changed how I think about domestic situations. In the future, I'll be more careful to investigate claims of abuse rather than dismissing them as private family matters. That means a great deal to me, Sheriff, but more importantly, it might save other women's lives." Judge Hamilton had lingered after dismissing the court, and now he approached Sarah with the measured dignity that had characterized his handling of her case. "Mrs. Monroe, I hope you understand the significance of what happened here today. This ruling will be cited in future cases throughout the territory and beyond. Your courage in facing these charges may well save lives." Sarah felt the weight of that responsibility, but it no longer felt crushing. Instead, it felt purposeful, a way of ensuring that Vincent's death had meaning beyond the immediate circumstances of their final confrontation. "Your Honor, I want you to know that I don't take that responsibility lightly. I plan to use this experience to help other women who find themselves in similar situations." "I had hoped you might," Judge Hamilton replied. "The law can only protect people if they understand their rights and have access to competent representation. There's much work to be done in that regard." As they walked out of the courthouse, Sarah noticed that several of the witnesses who had spoken on her behalf were waiting outside. Mrs. Garrett, the shopkeeper who had testified about seeing her bruises, stepped forward with tears in her eyes. "My dear, I'm so sorry it took so long for someone to believe you. We all knew something was wrong, but we didn't know how to help." "You helped by speaking the truth when it mattered," Sarah replied. "That took courage too." Reverend Foster approached. Next, his clerical collar somehow making his words carry additional weight. "Mrs. Monroe, I wonder if you might consider speaking to our Women's Auxiliary about your experiences. Many of our congregation members are married to difficult men, and they could benefit from understanding that they have options." The suggestion was both flattering and daunting. Public speaking about her ordeal would require a kind of vulnerability that still frightened her, but it would also be a way of putting Judge Hamilton's words into action, using her experience to protect other women. "I'd be honored to speak with them, Reverend, but I think the message needs to be broader than just individual survival stories. We need to talk about changing the systems that make women vulnerable in the first place." Thomas smiled at her response, clearly pleased by the direction of her thinking. Over the past months, their conversations had evolved from basic survival planning to more sophisticated discussions of legal reform and social change. Sarah was no longer content with simply escaping her own situation. She wanted to transform the conditions that had created it. Jacob Henley, the rancher who had finally spoken up about Vincent's abuse, approached with his hat in his hands and shame written across his weathered features. "Ma'am, I need to say something that's been weighing on my conscience." "Of course, Mr. Henley. I knew your husband was hurting you, and I did nothing. Told myself it wasn't my place to interfere, that what happened between man and wife was private business. But I was wrong, and my silence might have cost you your life if you hadn't been strong enough to save yourself." Sarah studied his face, seeing genuine remorse, but also something else. A man grappling with the realization that his inaction had consequences beyond his own comfort. "Mr. Henley, I appreciate your honesty, but what matters now isn't what you didn't do then. It's what you're willing to do going forward. Are you prepared to speak up if you see other women in similar situations?" "Yes, ma'am, I am. And I'll make sure my sons understand that protecting women from violence is every man's responsibility, not just the law's." As the crowd gradually dispersed, Sarah found herself alone with Thomas outside the courthouse, breathing the crisp mountain air and feeling the sun on her face with a clarity that seemed almost supernatural. Everything looked different now, brighter, more substantial, filled with possibilities she'd never allowed herself to imagine. "What happens now?" Thomas asked, echoing the question she'd been pondering herself. "Now I figure out how to turn what I've learned into something that can help other women." Judge Hamilton was right. This case establishes precedent, but precedent only matters if people know about it and understand how to use it. They walked slowly through Pine Creek's main street, Sarah taking note of details she'd missed during her anxious arrival days earlier. It was a thriving community with solid infrastructure, good schools, and the kind of civic institutions that suggested stability and growth. It could be a good place to establish the kind of advocacy work she was beginning to envision. "Thomas," she said as they reached the edge of town, "I've been thinking about what you said months ago about using my experience to help others. I think I'm ready to make that more than just an abstract idea." "What did you have in mind?" Sarah paused, organizing thoughts that had been crystallizing throughout the morning's proceedings. "I want to create a resource for women who are trapped in violent marriages, not just temporary shelter, but comprehensive support that includes legal advocacy, job training, and long-term assistance with building independent lives." "That's ambitious," Thomas observed. "Also necessary and probably revolutionary. Where would you start?" "Here, in Pine Creek. The community has just seen a case that demonstrated why such resources are needed, and Judge Hamilton's ruling provides legal foundation for the work. Plus, there are people here, like Mrs. Garrett and Reverend Foster, who might be willing to help." Thomas nodded slowly, his expression showing both excitement and concern. "It would require significant funding, careful organization, and probably years of work to establish effectively. Are you prepared for that kind of commitment?" "I'm prepared for whatever it takes," Sarah replied, with conviction that surprised even her. "Thomas, for 2 years I felt powerless and worthless, convinced that my life had no value beyond what someone else assigned to it. Today I learned that I was wrong, that I have the strength to fight for myself and win. Now I want to help other women discover that same strength." As they talked, Sarah's vision became more detailed and practical. She envisioned a house where women could stay safely while sorting out legal situations, educational programs that would teach marketable skills, and a network of advocates who could navigate the legal system on behalf of women too frightened or traumatized to do so themselves. "The most important thing," she said, "would be changing how people think about domestic violence. Today's hearing showed that when people understand the reality of abuse, they're capable of compassion and justice. But most of the time, that understanding doesn't exist." "So you're talking about public education as well as direct services?" "Exactly. Speaking to church groups, writing articles for newspapers, maybe even lobbying for legislative changes that would provide better legal protections for women. Sarah felt her excitement building as the possibilities expanded. Thomas, we could actually change things, not just help individual women escape bad situations, but transform the systems that create those situations in the first place. Thomas stopped walking and turned to face her fully, his expression serious and intent. Sarah, what you're describing would be dangerous work. There are people who benefit from keeping women powerless, and they won't appreciate efforts to change that. Are you prepared for the backlash such work would inevitably provoke? The question forced Sarah to confront realities she'd been avoiding. Advocating for women's rights would indeed make enemies, men who saw female independence as a threat to their authority, community leaders who preferred traditional arrangements, even some women who feared change more than they valued freedom. I killed a man to save my own life, she said finally. I think I can handle whatever opposition this work might generate. That's not the same kind of danger, and you know it. Vincent's violence was personal and immediate. The opposition to women's rights advocacy can be systematic, sustained, and sometimes lethal. Look what happened to some of the abolitionists before the war. Sarah appreciated his concern, but it only strengthened her resolve. Thomas, 3 months ago, I was a terrified woman running through a snowstorm with nowhere to go and no one to help me. Today I'm someone who stood up in court and convinced a judge that my life had value worth protecting. If I can survive that transformation, I can survive whatever comes next. They had reached the outskirts of town, where the road led, back toward the mountains and Thomas's cabin. Sarah realized that this moment represented a crossroads. She could return to the safety of mountain isolation, or she could move forward into the uncertain but meaningful work she was beginning to envision. There's something else I need to tell you, Thomas said as they stood looking back toward Pine Creek. Something I've been thinking about since we started planning your future. What's that? I don't want to go back to living alone in the mountains. These past months have reminded me what it feels like to be part of something larger than my own survival. He paused, clearly choosing his words carefully. I'd like to help you build whatever you're planning to create, not as your protector or benefactor, but as your partner in work that matters. The offer was both generous and practical. Thomas brought resources, connections, and legal knowledge that would be invaluable for the kind of advocacy work Sarah envisioned. But more than that, he brought the steady partnership that had already proven so crucial to her recovery and growth. Are you certain? She asked. This kind of work would mean leaving your mountain sanctuary permanently, dealing with all the complications of public life, taking risks that go far beyond personal safety. I'm certain, Thomas replied without hesitation. Sarah, helping you these past months has been the most meaningful work I've done since before Catherine died. You've given me a reason to re-engage with the world instead of just hiding from it. As they stood together on the road between Sarah's past and her future, she felt the pieces of her new life falling. Part 6. The Resolution, Victory. The Pine Creek jail was a cramped, windowless cell carved into the stone foundation of the sheriff's office, cold enough that Sarah's breath formed clouds in the stale air. She'd been there for 4 days, marking time by the meals Deputy Martinez brought her, watery soup and hard bread that spoke more of neglect than malice. The isolation was the hardest part, the way silence pressed against her ears until she found herself straining to hear any sound from the world above. On the 5th morning, Sheriff Crawford appeared outside her cell with a ring of keys and an expression she couldn't quite read. Mrs. Monroe, Judge Hamilton wants to see you. We're going upstairs for a preliminary hearing. Sarah rose from the narrow cot where she'd been lying, her muscles stiff from cold and inactivity. A hearing? I thought there would be a trial first. Judge wants to hear your story before he decides whether this case warrants a full trial or if it can be resolved more simply. Crawford unlocked the cell door, his movements careful but not unkind. Your friend Mr. Whitmore arrived yesterday with some interesting information. Seems he's been busy since we took you in. Hope flickered in Sarah's chest as Crawford led her up the wooden stairs to the main floor of the sheriff's office. Through the windows, she could see Pine Creek's main street, busy with the morning activities of a frontier town. Merchants opening their shops, horses and wagons moving goods, children running between buildings with the casual freedom she'd almost forgotten existed. The courthouse was a single large room above Henderson's general store, furnished with mismatched chairs and a scarred wooden table that served as the judge's bench. Judge Hamilton was a thin, stern-faced man with wire spectacles and the careful posture of someone who'd spent decades making difficult decisions. Thomas sat in the front row of chairs, dressed in his best clothes and holding a leather portfolio. That looked official and important. Also present were Deputy Martinez, George Henley from the original posse, and 3 people Sarah didn't recognize. A well-dressed woman who might have been a teacher or shopkeeper, an elderly man with calloused hands that suggested manual labor, and a younger man wearing the collar of a minister. All of them watched her with the intense curiosity of people who'd heard her story second-hand and wanted to judge its truth for themselves. "Mrs. Monroe," Judge Hamilton said, as Crawford guided her to a chair facing the bench, "I've called this hearing to determine whether the charges against you warrant proceeding to trial or whether the circumstances of Vincent Harlow's death suggest a different interpretation of events." Sarah nodded, her throat too dry for speech. She could feel the weight of every gaze in the room, the collective attention of people whose decision would determine whether she lived or died. "Mr. Whitmore has presented me with some compelling information regarding your situation, but I want to hear your account directly from you. Tell me what happened the night Vincent Harlow died, and don't leave out any details you think might be relevant." Sarah took a deep breath, drawing on the strength she'd found during her weeks with Thomas. "Your Honor, Vincent had been drinking at Henderson's saloon for most of the day. When he came home that evening, he was drunk and angry about something. I never knew what set him off. It could be anything or nothing. Had you argued that day?" "No, sir. I'd spent the day washing clothes and preparing his dinner. When he walked through the door, I could see the rage in his eyes, but I tried to avoid confrontation by staying busy in the kitchen." Judge Hamilton made notes on a piece of paper, his pen scratching loudly in the quiet room. "Continue." "He demanded to know why dinner wasn't on the table, even though it was still an hour before he usually ate. When I explained that I'd been waiting for him to come home, he accused me of lying, of making excuses." Sarah's voice grew steadier as she spoke, the words she'd rehearsed in her mind taking on the rhythm of truth. "That's when he grabbed my wrist and twisted it behind my back, the way he'd done before when he wanted to hurt me without leaving visible marks." "You say, the way he'd done before. Are you claiming this was part of a pattern of violence?" "Yes, sir. Vincent had been hitting me for nearly 2 years, ever since about 6 months after our wedding. It started with slapping when he'd been drinking, but it got progressively worse over time." Thomas stood up from his seat. "Your Honor, may I present evidence that supports Mrs. Monroe's claims?" Judge Hamilton nodded, and Thomas approached the bench with his portfolio. "I've gathered statements from 3 residents of Pine Creek who witnessed evidence of Vincent Harlow's violence toward his wife, though they didn't feel comfortable reporting it at the time." He handed several papers to the judge, who read them with growing attention. Sarah saw the woman she'd noticed earlier nod slightly when the judge glanced in her direction, and she realized this must be one of the witnesses Thomas had found. "Mrs. Elizabeth Garrett, the judge read aloud, states that she observed Mrs. Monroe in Henderson's store on September 15th with visible bruises on her face and arms, and that when asked about them, Mrs. Monroe claimed to have fallen downstairs. Mrs. Garrett notes that Mrs. Monroe seemed nervous and frightened, especially when her husband's name was mentioned. Sarah remembered that day. Vincent had beaten her the night before for burning his breakfast, and she'd been forced to go to town for supplies despite the obvious marks on her face. She'd invented the story about falling, knowing that no one would believe the truth or do anything about it if they did. Judge Hamilton continued reading. Reverend Michael Foster states that on October 2nd he encountered Mrs. Monroe outside the church with what appeared to be finger-shaped bruises around her throat. When he offered assistance, she declined and hurried away, seeming frightened that someone might have seen them talking. The minister in the back row, Reverend Foster, apparently, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, I regret not pressing the matter at the time. I suspected domestic violence, but felt constrained by the belief that such matters were private family concerns. I've since reconsidered that position, and Mr. Jacob Henley," the judge read from the third statement, "reports observing Vincent Harlow on multiple occasions grabbing, pushing, or otherwise physically intimidating his wife in public settings. Mr. Henley notes that Mrs. Monroe appeared to live in constant fear of her husband's reactions. The elderly man with calloused hands, Jacob Henley, George's father apparently, stood briefly. Judge, I seen that man treat his wife like she was his property to abuse as he pleased. Should have spoken up before now, but I figured it wasn't my business. I was wrong about that." Judge Hamilton set down the papers and looked directly at Sarah. "These statements suggest a pattern of abuse, Mrs. Monroe, but they don't explain what happened the night Vincent Harlow died. Continue with your account of that evening." Sarah nodded, feeling bolstered by the evidence that she hadn't been as alone or unnoticed as she'd believed. "After Vincent grabbed my wrist, I tried to pull away, but that only made him angrier. He started yelling about how I was planning to leave him, how I looked at other men, how I was an ungrateful wife who didn't appreciate what I had. Was there any truth to his accusations? No, sir. I'd never been unfaithful, never even considered it. But Vincent was jealous by nature, and alcohol made it worse. He saw threats and betrayals everywhere, even when they didn't exist." What happened next? Sarah closed her eyes, bringing back the memory she'd tried so hard to forget. "He pushed me against the kitchen counter, and that's when his hands went around my throat. He'd choked me before, but never like this. This time I could see in his eyes that he meant to finish it, that he wasn't going to stop until I was dead. How can you be certain of his intent? Because he told me so. He said, 'I'll kill you before I let you leave me.' And then he squeezed harder. I couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but claw at his hands. The kitchen knife was on the counter behind me. I'd been using it to slice bread for his dinner. I grabbed it without thinking and thrust upward, trying to make him let go." Judge Hamilton leaned forward. "You're saying you stabbed him to make him release you, not necessarily to kill him?" "Yes, sir. I just wanted him to stop choking me so I could breathe again. When the knife went in, he stumbled backward and let go of my throat, but then he fell down and I realized—" Sarah's voice broke slightly. "I realized I'd killed him." "What did you do then?" "I panicked. I knew that a dead husband and a living wife would look like murder to anyone who found us, regardless of the circumstances, so I packed a bag and ran." Deputy Martinez spoke up from his position near the door. "Judge, even if we accept her story about being attacked, she still fled. The scene of a killing. That suggests consciousness of guilt." Thomas rose again. "Your Honor, it suggests consciousness of how domestic violence is typically treated by the justice system. Mrs. Monroe had every reason to believe that her word would count for nothing against the presumption that wives who kill their husbands are inherently guilty." Judge Hamilton considered this, his fingers drumming against the wooden table. "Mr. Whitmore, You've presented compelling evidence of abuse, but the law requires more than that to justify homicide. Can you demonstrate that Mrs. Monroe's life was truly in immediate danger? Thomas opened his portfolio again and withdrew several more papers. Your Honor, I've taken the liberty of consulting with Dr. Patrick Morrison in Butte City, who specializes in injuries related to strangulation. Based on his examination of the physical evidence and my description of Mrs. Monroe's condition when she arrived at my cabin, he provided a medical opinion. He handed the papers to Judge Hamilton, who read them with careful attention. Sarah watched the judge's expression change as he absorbed whatever Dr. Morrison had concluded. Dr. Morrison states that the pattern and severity of bruising Mrs. Monroe exhibited were consistent with near-fatal strangulation, Judge Hamilton read aloud. He notes that such injuries typically result from sustained pressure lasting several minutes, during which the victim would experience genuine fear of imminent death. The judge looked up at Sarah. Mrs. Monroe, Dr. Morrison's report supports your claim that you were in immediate mortal danger. Combined with the evidence of ongoing abuse and the witness statements regarding your husband's violent behavior, I'm prepared to make a ruling on this matter. Sarah felt her heart racing as Judge Hamilton organized his papers and prepared to speak. Everything she'd endured, everything she'd fought for, came down to this moment and this man's interpretation of justice. The law recognizes that citizens have the right to defend themselves when faced with imminent threat of death or serious bodily harm, Judge Hamilton began, his voice carrying the formal weight of legal pronouncement. While the death of any person is tragic, the evidence presented suggests that Vincent Harlow's death resulted from Mrs. Monroe's reasonable and necessary response to a credible threat against her own life. Sarah felt tears begin to flow down her cheeks, though she wasn't sure yet whether they were tears of relief or fear. Furthermore, the judge continued, the pattern of abuse documented by multiple witnesses establishes that Mrs. Monroe had legitimate reason to fear for her safety when confronted by her husband's violence. Her decision to flee after the incident, while regrettable, is understandable given the historical reluctance of legal institutions to protect women in her situation. Judge Hamilton stood, his decision made. Therefore, I find that the death of Vincent Harlow constituted justifiable homicide in defense of life. The charges of murder against Mrs. Sarah Monroe are hereby dismissed. Mrs. Monroe, you are free to go. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, so unexpected and overwhelming that she nearly collapsed. Free. After months of running, weeks of hiding, days of imprisonment, she was free. Thomas was beside her in an instant, his steady presence grounding her as the reality of the judge's words sank in. Thank you, she whispered to Judge Hamilton, her voice barely audible. Thank you for listening, for believing me. Mrs. Monroe, the judge said, his stern expression softening slightly, I want you to understand that this ruling establishes precedent. Other women in similar situations will be able to point to this case as evidence that the law can protect them when they protect themselves. Your courage in facing these charges may save lives beyond your own. Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of responsibility that came with her freedom. She wasn't just Sarah Monroe anymore. She was a legal precedent, a symbol of what was possible when women refused to accept violence as their inevitable fate. As the courtroom began to empty, Thomas placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. How does it feel? He asked. Like waking up from a nightmare, Sarah replied, looking around the room that had been the site of her liberation. Like discovering I'm stronger than I ever knew I could be. Sheriff Crawford approached them, his earlier antagonism replaced by something that might have been respect. Mrs. Monroe, I owe you an apology. I came into this case assuming guilt and looking for confirmation rather than truth. That was wrong, and I'm sorry. Thank you, Sheriff. That means more than you know. As they walked out of the courthouse into the bright mountain sunshine, Sarah felt a sense of completion that went beyond simple relief. She had faced the worst the world could throw at her and emerged not just intact, but transformed. The frightened woman who had stabbed her husband in desperate self-defense was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and would never again accept less than she deserved. "What happens now?" Thomas asked as they stood together on Pine Creek's main street, breathing the crisp air of late autumn. Sarah looked around at the town that had witnessed her vindication, then up at the mountains that had sheltered her transformation. "Now I get to decide who I want to become, instead of being told who I have to be." The future stretched ahead of her, uncertain but no longer terrifying. For the first time in her adult life, Sarah Monroe was truly free. Free from violence, free from fear, and free to write the next chapter of her story in her own words. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.